Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive into the lives and legacies of figures who have profoundly shaped our world. Today, we're going to tackle a name that evokes a potent mix of awe and horror, a man whose shadow stretched across the 20th century and whose decisions continue to reverberate even today. Joseph Stalin. When we think of Stalin, images of industrial might, brutal purges, and wartime leadership often come to mind. But the full picture is far more intricate, woven with threads of poverty, ambition, ideology, and an unyielding will to power. We're not just going to skim the surface here. We're going to peel back the layers of this incredibly complex figure, from his humble, violent beginnings in a small Georgian town to his ascent as the supreme dictator of the Soviet Union, and the lasting, often devastating impact he had on millions of lives and the global stage. So settle in, because this is going to be a journey through one of history's most compelling and chilling narratives. Let's start at the very beginning, in a place called Gori, in the Caucasus region of the Russian Empire, modern-day Georgia. Here in 1878, Iosif Vissarionovich Dzhugashvili was born. This wasn't a childhood of privilege or comfort. It was a childhood steeped in grinding poverty. His father, Besarion, was a cobbler, a craftsman, but tragically he was also an alcoholic who subjected his wife and son to routine abuse. Imagine growing up in that environment, where the very person who should protect you is a source of fear and pain. It's a crucible that undoubtedly forged a certain hardness, a resilience, perhaps even a ruthlessness in the young Iosif. His mother, Ekaterina, on the other hand, was a devout and hardworking domestic servant. She doted on her son, and crucially she was determined that he receive an education, a ticket, she hoped, out of their miserable circumstances. But his physical challenges were as significant as his emotional ones. At the tender age of 7, he suffered a severe bout of smallpox, which left his face permanently scarred. And then there was his left arm, visibly mangled and shorter than his right, an injury widely believed to be from being struck by a horse-drawn carriage. This wasn't just a physical impairment. It was a constant reminder, a source of lifelong physical limitations, and critically, it contributed to a deep-seated sense of inferiority. Think about that for a moment. A child, bearing physical scars and deformities, living in poverty, experiencing abuse. How does that shape a personality? How does that drive someone to overcome, to prove themselves, perhaps to overcompensate? It's a crucial piece of the puzzle in understanding the man he would become. Despite these immense hardships, Iosif was undeniably intelligent and driven. He excelled academically at the church school in Gori, displaying a sharp memory and even a talent for poetry. Yes, the future dictator once penned verses. In 1894, his academic prowess earned him a scholarship to the Tiflis Theological Seminary, a prestigious institution in Georgia. But this wasn't a place of enlightenment and open inquiry. It was an oppressive, authoritarian environment. Students were forbidden to read secular literature, and this strict religious regimen, designed to instill conformity, had the opposite effect on the young Jughashvili. It sparked rebellion. It was within the very walls of this seminary, ironically, that Stalin first encountered illegal Marxist literature. He secretly devoured the writings of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin. Imagine the intellectual explosion in his mind, moving from the rigid doctrines of the church to the revolutionary ideas of class struggle and historical materialism. He began participating in underground socialist discussion groups, forming a radical worldview that wasn't about incremental change, but about a violent, revolutionary overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy. His growing devotion to revolutionary politics inevitably led to frequent clashes with the seminary authorities, and in 1899, just months before he would have graduated, he was expelled. He never earned a degree, but he plunged full-time into the dangerous, clandestine world of revolutionary work. This expulsion wasn't a setback, it was a launching pad. Now, he was fully committed to the cause. He operated in the shadows, taking temporary work as a meteorologist at the Tiflis Physical Observatory, but that was just a cover. His true vocation was organizing the working class. He moved to the industrial port city of Batumi in 1901, actively agitating among striking oil workers, helping to establish a local committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDLP. During these early years, Stalin developed a hardened, pragmatic approach to revolution. He wasn't one for abstract intellectual debates in European cafes like many of his contemporaries. He was a practico, a hands-on organizer, willing to get his hands dirty. He aligned himself with the radical Bolshevik faction, led by Vladimir Lenin. This was a crucial choice. While other factions debated the nuances of theory, the Bolsheviks were about action, about seizing power. Stalin organized secret printing presses, distributed illegal pamphlets, and frequently clashed with both the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, and rival political factions. He was in the thick of it, constantly on the run. His illicit activities made him a prime target. He was first arrested in April 1902 and spent the next several years cycling through various prisons and remote exiles in Siberia. But here's where his extraordinary resilience comes into play. He demonstrated an impressive capacity to endure the harsh realities of exile, frequently escaping to return to his revolutionary duties under a series of aliases. The most notable of these was Koba, taken from a heroic character in a Georgian novel, a kind of romantic, rebellious figure. And then, in the 1910s, he officially adopted the name Stalin, which, as many of you know, derives from the Russian word for steel. It's a name that perfectly encapsulated the unyielding iron will he possessed. By 1907, Stalin had cemented his reputation as a key figure within the Bolshevik movement in the Caucasus. He operated primarily in the volatile city of Baku, a hub of oil production and labor unrest. His activities included orchestrating strikes, fostering labor unrest, and significantly, funding the party's illegal activities. The Bolsheviks, desperate for cash, turned to what they called expropriations, essentially armed robberies of banks and state treasuries. Stalin, with Lenin's tacit approval, helped organize the infamous 1907 Tiflis bank robbery. This wasn't some minor heist. A gang of Bolsheviks ambushed a stagecoach carrying money, resulting in the deaths of several people and the theft of a massive sum of rubles. This money went directly to fund the party, showing Stalin's willingness to engage in extreme, violent acts for the cause. Lenin recognized Stalin's organizational skills and his unwavering loyalty. In 1912, Stalin was co-opted into the Bolshevik Central Committee. He traveled to Vienna to meet with Lenin, who highly valued Stalin's practical, no-nonsense approach and his understanding of the national question, the complex issue of how to treat minority ethnic groups within the vast Russian Empire. Stalin even penned a major theoretical tract, Marxism and the National Question, which solidified his status as one of Lenin's top lieutenants. He wasn't just a thug. He could also engage with theory, though always with a pragmatic, results-oriented bent. His time as a free revolutionary, however, came to a close in 1913 when he was arrested for the last time. He was banished to the remote Turukhansk region near the Arctic Circle in Siberia. Imagine the desolate, frozen landscape, the isolation. He remained in this harsh exile until the collapse of the Tsarist regime in 1917, surviving by hunting and fishing, reflecting on the future of the socialist movement. This extended period of isolation, after years of intense, dangerous activity, must have further hardened his resolve and perhaps deepened his strategic thinking. Then came 1917, a year of monumental upheaval for the Russian Empire. The abdication of Tsar Nicholas II during the February Revolution brought about a new era. Stalin, along with many other exiled revolutionaries, was granted amnesty. He immediately traveled to Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, and upon his arrival, he swiftly took control of the Bolshevik newspaper, Pravda. This was a strategic move, giving him a powerful platform and a voice within the burgeoning revolutionary landscape. Initially, Stalin and the other editors of Pravda adopted a somewhat moderate stance, even arguing for conditional support of the newly formed provisional government. This was a common initial reaction among some Bolsheviks. However, this moderation evaporated like morning mist upon Lenin's dramatic return to Russia in April 1917. Lenin, with his famous April Theses, denounced the provisional government and called for immediate Soviet power to the workers' and soldiers' councils. Stalin, ever the disciplined follower, swiftly aligned himself with Lenin's radical vision, abandoning his initial hesitations and proving his loyalty. This ability to adapt, to follow the stronger leader, was a hallmark of his early career. During the chaotic months of 1917, while Lenin was forced to hide in Finland to escape arrest by the provisional government, Stalin operated as a critical behind-the-scenes operator. He managed the day-to-day operations of the Bolshevik Central Committee, liaised with workers and soldiers, and meticulously prepared the party for an eventual insurrection. He wasn't the charismatic orator like Trotsky, but he was the indispensable organizer, the man who made the trains run on time, so to speak, in a revolutionary context. When the Bolsheviks finally seized power in the October Revolution of 1917, overthrowing the provisional government and establishing a new Soviet state, Stalin was right at the center of the action. He was appointed to the first Soviet cabinet, the Council of People's Commissars, serving as the People's Commissar for Nationalities. This role was far more significant than it might sound. He was tasked with managing the affairs of the vast array of non-Russian ethnic groups that populated the former Russian Empire. This gave him immense bureaucratic power, allowing him to build connections and exert influence across diverse regions, a crucial step in building his future power base. Shortly after taking power, the young Soviet state was plunged into a brutal civil war. On one side was the Bolshevik Red Army. On the other, a loose, often fractured coalition of anti-Bolshevik white forces, foreign interventionists, and various regional warlords. This was a fight for survival, and Stalin proved to be a ruthless and effective military commander and political commissar. He was dispatched to several critical fronts, most notably the defense of the strategic city of Tsaritsyn in 1918, a city that would later be renamed Stalingrad, in a chilling foreshadowing of his future dominance. In Tsaritsyn, Stalin demonstrated the brutal methodologies that would come to define his rule. He ruthlessly purged military experts he deemed disloyal, took hostages, and used draconian measures to ensure the Red Army held the city against white attacks. While his heavy-handed tactics occasionally brought him into conflict with Leon Trotsky, the brilliant intellectual who headed the Red Army, Stalin's directness and ability to achieve results earned him the trust of Lenin. By the end of the Civil War, in 1922, Stalin had secured a formidable reputation, a fierce, pragmatic, and uncompromising enforcer of Bolshevik will. He was the man who got things done, no matter the cost. Now, with the Civil War drawing to a close and the Soviet state beginning the arduous process of rebuilding, Stalin's power within the Communist Party grew exponentially. This is where his political genius, or perhaps his Machiavellian cunning, truly shone. In April 1922, the Central Committee appointed Stalin to the newly created and seemingly administrative position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. On the surface, it appeared to be a bureaucratic role, perhaps even a demotion from his wartime command. But this position proved to be the masterstroke of his political career. While rivals like Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev engaged in grand theoretical debates and public posturing, Stalin quietly set to work, mastering the party's growing bureaucracy. As General Secretary, he controlled the party apparatus. He held the power of patronage, meaning he had the authority to appoint, promote, and transfer party officials at all levels. Imagine the sheer leverage this gave him. Systematically, Stalin began to replace potential rivals with loyalists and subordinates who owed their careers entirely to him. It was like building a vast, interconnected web of loyalty, thread by thread, until he had woven an unbreakable net. By the end of 1922, Lenin's health began to rapidly deteriorate following a series of strokes. This initiated a silent, fierce succession battle within the upper echelons of the Bolshevik Party. Trotsky, the celebrated hero of the Civil War, the brilliant orator and intellectual, was widely viewed as Lenin's most likely successor. But here's the twist. Trotsky was deeply unpopular within the party due to his perceived arrogance, his intellectual aloofness, and his former disagreements with Lenin. He was the dazzling star, but he lacked the grassroots support and the crucial personal connections within the party machinery. Stalin, ever the opportunist, masterfully capitalized on this. He formed a political alliance, a triumvirate, with Zinoviev and Kamenev, two other prominent Bolsheviks. Together, they isolated Trotsky, portraying him as a factionalist and a threat to party unity. Stalin shrewdly positioned himself as a moderate central figure, merely carrying on Lenin's legacy. He was the steady hand, the loyal disciple, while Trotsky was painted as the dangerous radical. But Lenin, despite his failing health, was not blind. In late 1922 and early 1923, realizing Stalin's growing ambition and ruthlessness, a bedridden Lenin dictated a series of notes that would become known as his testament. In these documents, Lenin harshly criticized the leading members of the party, but he was particularly scathing towards Stalin. Lenin noted that Stalin had concentrated boundless power in his hands, and suggested that he was too rude and capricious to hold the position of General Secretary. Lenin recommended that Stalin be removed from his post. This was a direct, fatal blow to Stalin's ambitions, if it were to see the light of day. However, Stalin's control of the party machinery was already so absolute that he and his allies were able to suppress Lenin's testament. When Lenin died in January 1924, Stalin orchestrated an elaborate, grandiose funeral, positioning himself as the chief mourner and Lenin's closest disciple. He began to codify a new ideology, Marxism-Leninism, which presented Lenin as a deity-like figure and Stalin as his rightful heir, the only one capable of truly carrying on the fallen leader's vision. It was a brilliant piece of political theater and ideological manipulation. With Lenin dead and his testament buried, Stalin turned his political guns on his former allies, Zinoviev and Kamenev. He utilized the very party machinery he had meticulously built to strip them of their influence. He then allied himself with the right wing of the party, led by Nikolai Bukharin. Stalin advocated for socialism in one country, a pragmatic and nationalistic policy that argued the Soviet Union could build a socialist society on its own, without waiting for the international communist revolution that Trotsky had championed. This resonated strongly with the party rank and file, who were weary of global revolutionary ambitions and yearned for stability and national strength. Trotsky, the internationalist, was outmaneuvered by Stalin, the nationalist. By 1928, Stalin had successfully defeated the left opposition led by Trotsky, who was subsequently exiled in 1929, eventually ending up in Mexico, where he was assassinated by a Soviet agent in 1940. Stalin then turned against Bukharin and the right opposition who had served their purpose. By 1929, Stalin had eliminated all major political rivals, effectively making himself the undisputed dictator of the Soviet Union. His rise was a masterclass in bureaucratic maneuvering, tactical alliances, and ruthless elimination of opposition. Having consolidated absolute political power, Stalin launched what he called a dramatic and catastrophic revolution from above in 1929. The Soviet Union was still an overwhelmingly agrarian and peasant-based economy, vastly underdeveloped compared to the capitalist powers of the West. Stalin was driven by a deep conviction, almost a paranoia, that the USSR needed to rapidly industrialize or be crushed by its enemies. As he famously stated in 1931, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed." This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a genuine fear, born from Russia's historical vulnerability and the geopolitical realities of the time. To achieve this breakneck industrialization, Stalin instituted the first five-year plan in 1928, a centralized economic model designed to rapidly build heavy industry from scratch. The plan set impossibly high production quotas for coal, iron, steel, and electricity. Imagine the sheer scale of this undertaking. Millions of peasant laborers were mobilized and relocated to massive industrial construction sites, such as the steel city of Magnitogorsk, built from nothing in the vast Russian steppes. The state engaged in extreme propaganda, utilizing the Stakhanovite movement, named after a coal miner who supposedly broke production records, to encourage workers to emulate him and exceed quotas. Despite widespread inefficiency, appalling living conditions, and the rampant use of forced labor, the first five-year plan did achieve remarkable growth in heavy industry, transforming the Soviet economic landscape. Factories sprang up, railway lines were laid, and the foundations for a modern industrial state were indeed built. But the human cost of this industrialization was staggering, almost unimaginable. To finance the purchase of foreign industrial machinery, the Soviet state needed to export massive quantities of grain. At the same time, Stalin sought to restructure the agricultural sector through the process of collectivization. Under this policy, millions of small independent peasant farms were forcibly merged into large, state-run collective farms, known as kolkhozes. This was not a voluntary process. It was a violent imposition. Collectivization was vehemently opposed by the peasantry, particularly the more prosperous farmers, whom Stalin labeled as kulaks. The term kulak itself was a pejorative, meaning fist, implying greedy exploiters. Stalin declared a policy of dekulakization, which resulted in the expropriation of their land, livestock, and property. Hundreds of thousands of kulaks were executed or arrested, and millions were deported to forced labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia. Imagine generations of families, rooted to their land, suddenly uprooted, dispossessed, and brutalized, all in the name of a distant, abstract ideology. The disruption caused by forced collectivization, combined with the extreme grain quotas demanded by the state to fund industrialization, resulted in a catastrophic, man-made famine from 1932 to 1933. The famine struck hardest in Ukraine, where it is known as the Holodomor, and also ravaged Kazakhstan and the North Caucasus. In these regions, the state aggressively confiscated all available grain and food from the peasantry, essentially using starvation as a weapon to force compliance and crush resistance to collectivization. Millions of people perished from starvation and related diseases, yet Stalin's regime denied the existence of the famine and continued to export grain to the West, selling it for desperately needed foreign currency to buy industrial equipment. This was a deliberate policy choice, prioritizing industrialization over human lives. The combination of the five-year plans and collectivization radically altered the fabric of Soviet society. It destroyed the traditional peasant way of life and subjected the entire population to the strict economic and political control of the totalitarian state. While it created the industrial foundation that would eventually allow the Soviet Union to survive the Second World War, it did so at the cost of millions of lives, a sacrifice that remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. As the 1930s progressed, Stalin's pursuit of total control manifested in an atmosphere of intense paranoia and state-sponsored terror. The assassination of Sergei Kirov, a popular party leader in Leningrad in December 1934, served as a catalyst for Stalin to unleash a period of mass repression known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror. On the surface, Kirov's murder appeared to be the act of a disgruntled former party member. But in reality, Kirov's assassination was likely carried out with Stalin's tacit approval, as Kirov was increasingly viewed as a potential rival due to his growing popularity and more moderate political stances. Stalin used this event, this convenient death, as a pretext to claim that there was a vast, treasonous conspiracy operating within the Communist Party, orchestrated by his former rivals like Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. The Great Purge, which peaked between 1936 and 1938, was orchestrated by the NKVD, the secret police, led at various times by chilling figures like Genrikh Yagoda and Nikolai Yezhov. The terror permeated every level of Soviet society. The NKVD utilized a system of quotas for arrests and executions, meaning that local branches were given targets for how many enemies of the people they had to identify and eliminate. No one was safe. First, Stalin purged the political elite. A series of infamous show trials were held in Moscow, theatrical productions designed to demonstrate the state's power and the supposed treachery of its enemies. Old Bolshevik heroes, including Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, were subjected to torture and psychological coercion. They were forced to confess to absurd and fabricated charges, such as plotting to assassinate Stalin, spying for foreign capitalist powers, and attempting to restore capitalism. It was a bizarre, Kafkaesque nightmare. Almost all of the defendants were found guilty and executed. These were men who had built the revolution alongside Lenin, now denounced and destroyed by their former comrade. Stalin then turned his attention to the military. Fearing a military coup, he initiated a devastating purge of the Red Army. Thousands of experienced officers, including a majority of the high command and marshals of the Soviet Union, were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. This catastrophic purge left the Soviet military severely weakened and lacking experienced leadership. A fatal blow, just as the existential threat of Nazi Germany loomed on the horizon. Imagine a nation preparing for war, and its leader deliberately decapitating its military leadership. It defies rational explanation, except through the lens of Stalin's absolute paranoia. Beyond the political and military elite, the terror spread to the general population. Intellectuals, scientists, artists, and ordinary citizens were arrested on flimsy pretexts, often denounced by neighbors or colleagues, to deflect attention from themselves. Fear became a pervasive force, forcing people to suspect everyone around them. Millions of people were arrested, subjected to kangaroo court trials, and sent to the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps located in the harshest regions of the Soviet Union, such as Kolyma and Vorkuta. In the camps, prisoners faced brutal conditions, extreme cold, starvation, and overwork, leading to countless deaths. The Gulag was not just a punishment, it was an economic engine fueled by slave labor. By the time the terror began to subside in 1938, Stalin had successfully eliminated all possible sources of opposition, including his former rivals, intellectuals, independent thinkers, and military leaders. The purges solidified his position as an absolute, unchallenged autocrat, but they also severely damaged the social, intellectual, and military fabric of the country. It was a self-inflicted wound of immense proportions. Throughout the 1930s, as the threat of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany grew in Europe, Stalin's foreign policy was characterized by a mixture of caution and opportunism. Initially, the Soviet Union attempted to forge collective security alliances with Britain and France against Nazi Germany. This was a logical move, given the ideological opposition between communism and fascism. However, these negotiations frequently broke down due to mutual distrust and the reluctance of Western democracies to ally with the communist Soviet state. The West was wary of Stalin, and Stalin was wary of the West. Frustrated by the lack of cooperation from the West, and fearing that the Soviet Union would be left to fight Germany alone, Stalin made a shocking diplomatic pivot in 1939. In August 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, two ideological archenemies, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that stunned the world. It was a deal with the devil, a moment of profound cynicism and pragmatism. The pact contained a public agreement that neither country would attack the other. However, it also included a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into respective German and Soviet spheres of influence. According to this protocol, the Soviet Union was given a free hand to annex Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Bessarabia, part of Romania, and the two powers agreed to partition Poland. For Stalin, the pact was a pragmatic, albeit cynical move to buy time. He knew that the Soviet military was ill-prepared for a war with Germany, particularly after the purges of the Red Army, and the pact allowed him to delay the inevitable conflict and expand the Soviet Union's western borders to create a buffer zone. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west, and shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, dividing the country between them. Stalin then launched the Winter War against Finland in late 1939. While the Soviet Union eventually forced Finland to cede territory, the Finnish military put up a fierce resistance, exposing significant weaknesses and poor leadership in the Red Army, further validating Stalin's fear of military unpreparedness. Stalin subsequently incorporated the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, into the Soviet Union in 1940, implementing Soviet-style repression and deportations in the newly annexed territories. Despite the non-aggression pact, Stalin was acutely aware that Hitler viewed the Soviet Union as his ultimate ideological enemy. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, or living space in the East, directly targeted Soviet territory. However, Stalin chose to ignore repeated intelligence warnings from both domestic and foreign sources, including Britain, that Germany was preparing to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. Stalin desperately hoped to avoid provoking Hitler and believed that Germany would not fight a two-front war. This colossal miscalculation, fueled by a mixture of denial and wishful thinking, would nearly cost him the entire Soviet state. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history, smashing into the Soviet Union. Stalin's refusal to heed warnings left the Red Army catastrophically unprepared, and the German forces made rapid, devastating advancements deep into Soviet territory. The initial weeks of the invasion were an unmitigated disaster for the Soviet Union. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured, vast amounts of equipment were destroyed, and major industrial centers were overrun. It was a national catastrophe. Upon receiving news of the invasion, Stalin reportedly fell into a deep depression and retreated to his dacha for several days, initially believing that all was lost. This was a rare moment of vulnerability for the Iron Dictator. However, he eventually recovered, rallied the Communist Party and the military, and addressed the Soviet people in a famous radio broadcast in July. He called it the Great Patriotic War, appealing not just to communist ideology, but to Russian nationalism and patriotism, invoking the historical struggles against foreign invaders. He ordered a scorched earth policy, demanding that anything of value be destroyed, so it could not fall into German hands, a brutal but effective tactic to deny resources to the advancing enemy. As the war progressed, Stalin evolved into a highly effective wartime leader. This is one of the great ironies and complexities of his legacy. Unlike Hitler, who frequently interfered with his generals' tactical decisions, Stalin eventually learned to delegate military strategy to his capable commanders, such as Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky. He established himself as the supreme commander of the Red Army and chairman of the State Defense Committee, maintaining absolute control over both the military effort and the wartime economy. His ruthlessness, previously directed inward, was now channeled outward against the foreign invader. Stalin's regime enacted a massive industrial relocation program. Before the Germans could capture the vital industrial regions in the West, thousands of factories were meticulously dismantled, loaded onto trains, and rebuilt thousands of miles to the east in the Ural Mountains and Siberia. This was an unprecedented logistical feat, ensuring that the Soviet Union could continue to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition for the war effort far from the front lines. The turning point of the war in Europe came in the winter of 1942 to 1943 at the Battle of Stalingrad. This was not just a battle. It was an epic struggle of wills, a symbol of Soviet defiance. Stalin ordered the Red Army to hold the city at all costs, issuing his famous Order No. 227, not a step backward. After months of grueling street-to-street combat in freezing conditions, the Soviet forces encircled and eventually defeated the German Sixth Army. This decisive victory halted the German advance and marked the beginning of the Soviet counteroffensive, which slowly but relentlessly pushed the Nazi forces back toward Berlin. Throughout the war, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting against Nazi Germany. While the Western Allies, the United States and Britain, provided crucial material support through the Lend-Lease program and eventually opened a second front in Western Europe in 1944, it was the Red Army that engaged and destroyed the bulk of the German military. This achievement came at an astronomical human cost. The Soviet Union suffered an estimated 27 million military and civilian deaths, the highest casualties of any nation in the war. The victory was immense, but the price was almost incomprehensible. Stalin's wartime leadership was also characterized by continued brutality. He issued draconian orders like "not a step backward," which mandated the execution of soldiers who retreated without orders, ensuring compliance through terror. He utilized penal battalions for suicide missions, sending condemned soldiers to the most dangerous parts of the front. The regime also carried out the mass deportation of various ethnic minorities, such as the Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and Volga Germans, who Stalin suspected of collaborating with the German invaders. Even in the face of an external enemy, the internal enemy, real or imagined, was still a target of his paranoia. As the war drew to a close, Stalin emerged as one of the most powerful and influential figures in the world. He participated in a series of critical wartime conferences with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, most notably the Tehran Conference in 1943, the Yalta Conference in 1945, and later the Potsdam Conference. These meetings were not just about winning the war. They were about shaping the post-war world. At these meetings, Stalin proved to be a shrewd and determined negotiator. His primary goal was clear: to ensure the security of the Soviet Union against future invasions, and to establish the USSR as a global superpower. He negotiated the redrawing of the map of Europe, securing Soviet dominance over the countries of Eastern Europe that the Red Army had liberated from Nazi control. This was his buffer zone, his sphere of influence. At Yalta and Potsdam, Stalin agreed in principle to allow free and democratic elections in the Eastern European countries occupied by Soviet troops. However, in practice, Stalin had no intention of relinquishing his grip on the region. The Red Army established puppet communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, creating a buffer zone of satellite states subservient to Moscow. This division of Europe laid the foundation for the Iron Curtain and the beginning of the Cold War. The seeds of future global conflict were sown in these wartime agreements. Stalin was also heavily focused on extracting reparations from Germany to rebuild the devastated Soviet economy. He oversaw the dismantling of German industrial infrastructure in the Soviet zone of occupation and its relocation to the USSR, a literal transfer of industrial capacity. In Asia, Stalin entered the war against Japan in August 1945, shortly after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The swift Soviet invasion of Manchuria allowed Stalin to reclaim territories lost in the Russo-Japanese War and expand Soviet influence in East Asia, paving the way for the rise of communism in China and North Korea. By the end of World War II, Stalin had achieved his overarching objectives. He had defeated the existential threat of Nazi Germany, expanded Soviet borders, and established the Soviet Union as a dominant global superpower capable of challenging the United States. He stood at the zenith of his power and influence. Following the conclusion of World War II, Stalin enjoyed unparalleled adulation and power within the Soviet Union. He was glorified in propaganda as the great architect of communism and the father of the nation. The Russian people, immensely proud of their victory over fascism, held him in high regard, despite the immense suffering they had endured under his rule. This shows the power of propaganda and national pride. even in the face of immense personal sacrifice. However, the post-war period did not bring relief to the Soviet populace. Stalin quickly reasserted totalitarian control to prevent any liberalizing tendencies that had emerged during the relative unity of the war. He feared that soldiers and citizens who had been exposed to the outside world during the campaign in Europe would bring back Western ideas and undermine the communist system. The Iron Curtain wasn't just geographical, it was ideological, designed to prevent contamination from the West. To combat this, Stalin initiated a period of intense ideological control and cultural repression known as the Zhdanovshchina, named after cultural official Andrei Zhdanov. Writers, artists, and scientists were heavily censored and forced to adhere to the party line. The regime promoted Russian nationalism, suppressed any expressions of Western influence, and demanded that all cultural production serve the interests of the state. Creativity and independent thought were stifled. Stalin also launched a campaign of anti-Semitism in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He dissolved the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, executed prominent Jewish intellectuals, and initiated campaigns against rootless cosmopolitans, a thinly veiled attack on Soviet Jews. This culminated in the chilling Doctors' Plot of 1953, in which a group of primarily Jewish Kremlin doctors were falsely accused of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders. This hysteria led to mass arrests and stoked fears that Stalin was preparing for another wave of massive purges, echoing the horrors of the 1930s. Internationally, the post-war era saw the rapid escalation of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Stalin was determined to consolidate the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe and expand Soviet influence globally. The tensions were exacerbated by the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, which Stalin viewed as American imperialist attempts to undermine Soviet security and encircle the Soviet Union. Stalin authorized the Berlin blockade in 1948, attempting to force the Western Allies out of West Berlin by cutting off all land and rail access. The blockade failed due to the massive Allied airlift, which supplied the city for nearly a year, a testament to Western resolve. Despite this setback, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, ending the American nuclear monopoly and significantly raising the stakes of the Cold War. The world was now locked in a nuclear standoff. In 1950, Stalin gave the green light for the invasion of South Korea by Communist North Korea, triggering the Korean War, which further intensified the global standoff between the capitalist and communist blocs. His influence was truly global. In his final years, Stalin became increasingly isolated, paranoid, and physically frail. He spent much of his time at his countryside dacha in Konsevo on the outskirts of Moscow, rarely venturing into the Kremlin or appearing in public. His inner circle lived in constant fear of his unpredictable mood swings and sudden bursts of rage. Stalin frequently pitted his top subordinates against each other, such as Vyacheslav Molotov and Georgy Malenkov, to ensure that no single individual could challenge his authority. This was a classic tactic of dictators, ensuring no rival could gain too much power. Stalin's physical health deteriorated significantly in the early 1950s. He was a heavy smoker, suffered from hypertension, and likely experienced several minor strokes. Yet despite his declining health, his grip on power remained absolute, and he continued to rule with the same ruthless determination. The fear he had instilled kept everyone in line. On March 1, 1953, after a night of drinking with his inner circle, which included Lavrenti Beria, Georgy Malenkov, Nikolai Bulganin, and Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage in his private quarters. Due to his own paranoia, his guards were terrified to disturb him, and he lay on the floor for several hours before he was eventually discovered. This is a chilling detail, the ultimate dictator, utterly alone and helpless, because his own system of fear prevented anyone from helping him. Stalin's top lieutenants arrived at the dacha, but were slow to summon medical help. They were initially unsure how to proceed, perhaps secretly relieved that the tyrannical dictator was finally incapacitated. Medical professionals eventually arrived and treated the stricken leader. But his condition was hopeless. Stalin lingered in a coma for several days, suffering from the effects of the stroke. He officially died on March 5, 1953, at the age of 74. His death triggered a massive outpouring of grief from the Soviet public, who had known no other leader for nearly 3 decades and had been conditioned to view him as a savior and a demigod. His funeral was an elaborate state affair, with his body embalmed and placed on display in the Lenin Mausoleum, alongside Vladimir Lenin, a testament to his enduring cult of personality. Joseph Stalin's legacy is one of the most complex and controversial in modern history. On one hand, he undeniably transformed the Soviet Union from a backward, agrarian society into a formidable industrial and military superpower. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union played the decisive role in the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II, an achievement that earned him enormous respect and legitimacy both domestically and internationally. For many years, his supporters pointed to this transformation as evidence of his greatness, arguing that his brutal methods were necessary to modernize the nation and protect it from foreign enemies. It's a compelling, if deeply flawed, argument. On the other hand, Stalin is universally remembered as one of the most brutal totalitarian dictators of the 20th century. His policies of forced collectivization and the resulting man-made famines in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and other regions led to the deaths of millions of peasants. The Great Purge of the 1930s resulted in the execution of countless party members, military officers, and innocent citizens, while millions more were condemned to the horrific conditions of the Gulag labor camps. Estimates of the total number of people who died as a result of Stalin's policies, purges, and forced labor range from the millions to upwards of 20 million. These aren't just statistics. They represent individual lives, families shattered, entire communities destroyed. Stalin's methods also caused long-term damage to the Soviet Union. The purge of the Red Army severely weakened the military on the eve of World War II, contributing directly to the catastrophic losses of the early years of the invasion. Furthermore, his policies destroyed the traditional agricultural base, stifled intellectual and cultural life through strict censorship, and left a legacy of fear and paranoia that permeated Soviet society for decades. It was a society built on terror, and that terror left deep, lasting scars. In 1956, just 3 years after Stalin's death, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, delivered a shocking secret speech at the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party. In this speech, Khrushchev publicly denounced Stalin's cult of personality, the atrocities committed during the Great Purge, and his military blunders. This initiated a period of de-Stalinization, which saw the removal of his monuments, the renaming of cities, such as Stalingrad becoming Volgograd, and the release of millions of political prisoners from the gulags. It was a monumental shift, an attempt to cleanse the party and the nation of his toxic legacy. Despite this official denunciation, Stalin's legacy remains the subject of significant debate. During the Cold War, historical assessments varied wildly between Soviet propaganda and Western historical scholarship. In the post-Soviet era, as Russia navigated the political and economic upheavals of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, public opinion regarding Stalin has fluctuated. While most historians and international observers unequivocally condemn his crimes, some segments of the Russian population view him with nostalgia, focusing on his role as a victorious wartime leader and the builder of a global empire, while downplaying or justifying the immense human cost of his regime. It's a complex interplay of national pride, historical memory, and the longing for a perceived past strength. Ultimately, Joseph Stalin remains a defining figure of the 20th century. His life and actions shaped the geopolitical landscape of the modern world, and his rule stands as a stark example of the perils of totalitarianism, the immense capacity for state-sponsored terror, and the complex, often contradictory nature of historical memory. It's a reminder that leaders can achieve immense power and transform nations, but the methods they employ and the human price they exact will forever define their place in history. So, What can we take away from this deep dive into Stalin's life? First, the profound impact of early life experiences. Poverty, abuse, and physical challenges can either crush an individual or forge an unyielding drive. Second, the insidious nature of power consolidation. Stalin's rise wasn't through charisma, but through meticulous bureaucratic control, patience, and the ruthless elimination of rivals. Third, the terrifying consequences of ideology taken to its extreme. The forced collectivization and industrialization, while achieving economic transformation, led to unimaginable human suffering and death. Fourth, the paradox of wartime leadership. A man capable of such internal brutality also proved to be a decisive, if ruthless leader, in the face of an existential external threat. And finally, the enduring contested legacy. How a figure can be simultaneously reviled as a mass murderer and revered as a national savior, depending on the lens through which history is viewed. It's a powerful lesson in the complexities of historical figures and the narratives we construct around them. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Joseph Stalin. It's a story that forces us to confront some of the darkest aspects of human nature and political power, but also to understand the forces that shape the world we live in today.